going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 meta decks for the March 2018 format. February had a huge impact on this game, from giving us a new ban list to having several premier events that help shape the meta for what we can anticipate the meta is going to look like moving into March of 2018. However, we're not going to be really getting a lot of new products, at least until the end of the month, that are going to be introducing new cards that are meta relevant, but there's still several premier events to look forward to this month, so this is going to give you a good idea of what the best decks are and what decks you should prepare yourself against if you plan on going to any of these large events. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons as always. So big shout out today to Jacob, to John, and to Andrew. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Starting off, of course, with number 5, we have 60 card Lightsworn Shiranui. Now, this is a deck that I had a little bit higher on my previous top 5 meta decks of February 2018, and the reason for that was, we just had a ban list dropped on us, and there was the potential for so many different decks to do well that really anything arguably could have been one of the best decks of the upcoming format. So I had high hopes for this deck, and even though I have it on the number 5 slot, this is backed up by some more empirical evidence this time around, because now we've had some track record for these decks to prove how well they're going to do in the upcoming format. 60 card Lightsworn Shiranui took several top cut slots not only at YCS Atlanta, but also at YCS Bochum, and it's been doing fairly well on the regional circuit as well. We've also seen, at least for some innovation for the deck, we've had the introduction of a small dinosaur engine. Now, people have been including cards like Soul Eating Oviraptor, Overtex Quatless Double Evolution Pill, as well as Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, with the hopes of, you're already milling a ton of cards and you have a ton of graveyard synergy, that having Quatless or having the ability to pretty much just summon out an Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, because we all know how busted that card is, in addition to everything else the 60 card Lightsworn Shiranui deck is capable of doing, is just an absolute amazing finisher. So by having this, it kind of just adds a whole new dimension to the deck and doesn't really take up a whole lot of space in the 60 card deck as a whole. I mean, you're already playing a 60 card deck, so you have to fill up those slots somehow, and I think that's a really cool innovation for the deck moving forward. Now, is that the superior build? I'm not too sure, and people are pretty split on whether or not you should include the Dino engine, at least from what I've been seeing, but ultimately, another reason that's been contributing to Lightsworn Shiranui's success is the decline in play of Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. Now, Ash Blossom is by no means out of the meta, but Ash Blossom has seen a decline in play, and a lot of players have been relegating it to the side deck. A lot of people have kind of been debating whether or not it's worth being in the main deck, because although it's really good against Pendulum Magician, you have this issue where it's really good against every other deck except Pendulum Magician, but then you have to pretty much debate with the fact that, okay, if I'm not playing this card, I have a weaker matchup against other decks, whereas it's not as good against the strongest decks. So, however, for Lightsworn Shiranui, every card in that deck is very susceptible to Ash Blossom. I mean, you got Orphis, Scorpio, Brilliant Fusion, Left Arm Offering, Grass, I could keep going on, but Ash Blossom is this deck's worst nightmare. So by having this card not seeing as much play maybe in game 1, that's actually very good for the 60 card player, because that means they're going to be resolving these cards a lot more often, and that's going to help contribute to their success as a whole, and might be the reason why we're seeing the deck make the top cut slots that we are. I think this is still definitely an extremely powerful deck. The ceiling that this deck has is absolutely absurd, and even though it's not the strongest deck, it's still definitely a lot of fun and something you need to watch out for moving into this format. Now, this moves us on to number 4, where we have Invoked Mechaknight. And I guess you can also throw other Invoked variants in here as well, because we've also seen a couple of pure Invoked variants topping as well, but I would say Invoked Mechaknight is actually the most popular build of Invoked that we've seen moving into this new format. Now, why is that? Well, Invoked is a very powerful engine on its own, but Invoked also has a lot of issues, and by including the Mechaknights as a supplement, Mechaknights kind of fix some of the problems that Invoked have in general. This is definitely going to be a going second strategy if you're choosing to play this, and the thing is, the idea that the whole deck has is that you're going to be playing against, Pendulum Magician, you're going to hand trap them to pretty much stop them dead in their tracks, because you're obviously going to be playing anywhere from 9 to 12 hand traps to kind of just slow their deck down entirely, entirely, and then in combination with the Invoked engine, getting your Alistair and getting your Makaba online, you've got the Mech Knights that kind of help give the deck a win condition and kind of help give the deck a little extra oomph moving into your later turns of the game. Because one of the biggest issues that Invoked has as a whole is that it was very incapable of producing a lot of damage onto the board. Now, Mech Knights not only have massive attack values, but also can just special summon themselves to the field, assuming they meet the proper conditions of having multiple cards in the same column, but also their light attribute, which means that you're having the synergy of giving yourself a Makaba and not having to rely on your opponent. So while Invoked provides the control aspect of the deck, Mech Knights kind of provide the more aggro aspect, and just in tandem can basically produce an absolutely incredible deck. We've seen some very high caliber players piloting this deck and almost made the top 32 of some of these events. And Invoked Mechknight has made the top cut of several of these events, taking 3 and 4 slots in some of these events respectively, and it's definitely a force to be reckoned with. Definitely with proper deck building and analyzing the meta and seeing that by opting to go second in basically every matchup, blind going second, you have a very strong advantage and can just basically flat out kill your opponent in a lot of instances as well. And then if you can't kill them, you can just sit on your Makaba and basically just play a control game. You've got options like Scapegoat. You've got a lot of different things that the deck can really do with the inclusion of the Mech Knights. And I really don't think this deck is going anywhere, and if anything, is only going to become more popular by some of the players who don't want to play some of the more higher tier options. Now this moves us on to number 3, and number 3 is going to be Trickstar. Now Trickstar is one of the decks that a lot of people were very polarized on, because a lot of people were thinking Trickstar is either going to be like one of the best decks of the format, or it's just absolute trash and is going to be one of the worst decks of the format because people were hyping it up. And the thing is, Trickstar actually managed to have the 3rd highest representation across all events in February. Now, that's crazy if you think about it, because the fact that it managed to take 4 top slots at YCS Bochum as well as YCS Atlanta, and was actually in contention for winning the event at the UDS Invitational in Sacramento, that's absolutely crazy. And Trickstar is just one of those decks where, very similarly to Invoked, a lot of players feel like it kind of has to forge its identity once a format defines itself, and that's something that I've been preaching here on the channel as well. But it seems that even with the format still in flux, Trickstar is able to do what it does and is able to snatch up wins left and right. Now granted, the deck still, in my opinion, fails to have a proper win condition outside of something like Scapegoat, because it's very difficult for the deck to get over big monsters, and it just has a hard time dealing with some of the threats that this format presents itself with. But at the same time, you have a very consistent 1-card engine, very similarly to Invoked. You have just absolutely amazing cards at your disposal, like Trickstar Reincarnation to disrupt your opponent, one of the greatest disruption cards we've ever seen in this game, and you have the ability to run cards that other decks cannot. The deck is very flexible, and I think because of that flexibility and that consistency, that's why we're seeing the deck still do so well. I don't know what the future of this deck is going to hold, but moving into the March 2018 format, this is definitely a deck you need to look out for, because as the meta becomes more defined, I feel Trickstar becomes better, but it's definitely something that's format dependent, and once we get into a little bit later of some other decks we have, it might not see as much play as a lot of people might expect. But for now, it's definitely worthy of that number 3 slot. Now this moves us on to number 2, which is True Draco. Now this is kind of what I was alluding to when it comes to Trickstar's relevance in the meta as a whole, because Masterpiece's existence in the meta makes it just very difficult for Trickstar to deal with altogether. Masterpiece, like, honestly, the only out that Trickstar really has to Masterpiece, in especially not counting side options or anything like that, is pretty much Borreload Dragon, and if they have a way to pretty much stop the Trickstar player from getting to Borreload, then Draco is just gonna flat out auto win that matchup more often than not. But going back to True Draco as a whole, this deck has really not lost anything, and if anything has only gotten stronger with some innovation at that, with the inclusion of a Mono Iwado basically just shutting down the entire board, as well as hand traps, meaning you can freely use cards like Duality, Desires, and Card of Demise without having fear of getting hit by Ash Blossom or getting hit, any of your cards getting hit by hand traps. You're allowed to play your turn freely, but also by just tribute summoning monsters, you're able to pop your opponent's cards with your True Draco spell and trap cards, and having that just blanket immunity to basically do anything you want in a given turn is absolutely incredible and is something you definitely cannot overlook. Dragonic Diagram is still at 3 and Masterpiece is still at 3, and that's something that you really can't overlook moving into this format, because Masterpiece, if Masterpiece exists in any format, it's just a formidable threat, and it's just one of those cards that if you don't have an answer to it, it's just gonna flat out win you the game as a whole, or you're just gonna be on the receiving end and flat out lose to this card because you can't answer a 2950 beater that can not only pop cards but is immune to several different types of card effects. This is definitely one of the strongest decks. It has so many tops in these past top 32s that we've seen from premier events that you can't deny that this deck is definitely worthy of the number 2 slot. And that moves us on to our number 1 deck of March 2018, and that deck has to be Pendulum Magician. You know, when Pendulum Magician takes over 50% representation at YCS Atlanta, about 30% representation at YCS Bochum, and over 40% representation at the UDS Winter Invitational in Sacramento, that just purely based on representation shows what a formidable threat Pendulum Magician is in this format. That's basically due in part to Heavy Metal Foe's Electromite, just enabling so much for the deck. We also have the Pendulum FDK running around, but even taking the Pendulum FDK out of it, Pendulum Magician is able to thrive just fine. You have so many different options because you have one of the best extra decks in the game, you have access to so many different powerful tools, and not to mention the deck is insanely consistent, whether or not you're discussing in terms of the FTK. You're able to assemble boards that have Vortex Dragon and multiple negates that your opponent has to play through if you end up going first, and even going second. As long as you're not getting floodgated out, your deck can play very well going second as well. So there's a ton of benefits for playing Pendulum Magician, but at the same time your deck also has a lot of weaknesses, being a pendulum based deck at that. And I think that's why we haven't seen the deck be overwhelmingly dominant, but it's still definitely the strongest deck of March 2018. Wrapping up this video though, I did want to mention one thing. Even though these are the top 5 decks of this format, that doesn't mean these are the only decks that are capable of winning. If you look at any of the meta charts that I've discussed in my meta analyses from YCS Atlanta, YCS Bochum, or the UDS Invitational Qualifier, there's so much diversity in the number of decks that are able to make the top 32. And out of all the decks I listed, Pendulum Magician was the only one that took one of those events in first place at YCS Atlanta. At YCS Bochum, World Chalice took first place, and at the UDS Invitational, Zephyra took first place. So even with all of these decks being the top 5 decks in my opinion, and having the highest representation from premier events that we've seen in the past, that doesn't mean you need to play these decks to win. There's a lot of room for innovation in this format, and I think that's what has me really excited for March and seeing what else this format has in store. A lot of players have the ability to come up with a lot of crazy shit, and I'm really excited to see where things go. So guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about what your choices would be for the top meta decks of March 2018. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.